Hi there. Please let your mind slow down and go at ease, and let me know in the comments where you're from. Also, what's your best tip for a peaceful night's sleep and keeping a calm mind? Whether it's a relaxing bedtime ritual, a favorite book, or a mindfulness practice, your advice could be just what someone needs. The lights in the forest. As a child, my family lived near a large forest that stretched for miles, filled with thick trees and overgrown trails. It was beautiful but eerie, especially at dusk, when shadows stretched long and the dense trees seemed to close in. There were old stories in our town about strange lights that appeared in the forest at night, flickering orbs that floated through the trees, glowing softly before disappearing without a trace. People said they were spirits, leading wanderers astray, but I'd never believed the tales. That changed one evening in late October. I was returning from a friend's house, walking down the dirt road that led past the edge of the forest. The sun was setting, casting a warm orange glow over the trees, and everything was silent, save for the soft crunch of leaves underfoot. I was lost in thought, barely noticing my surroundings when I saw it. A soft light, just a faint glow, hovering between the trees. At first, I thought it was a firefly, or maybe a reflection of the setting sun. But as I got closer, I realized it was something else entirely. The light was too steady, too bright, and it floated just above the ground, bobbing gently as though it were moving on its own. I stopped, staring, and the light seemed to notice me, drifting closer, its glow illuminating the trees in an eerie, pale light. I felt a strange pull, an urge to follow, and before I knew it, I was stepping off the road into the forest, my gaze fixed on the light. It moved deeper into the trees, weaving between trunks and over fallen branches, its glow flickering like a candle in the wind. I followed, feeling as though I were in a trance, the world around me growing darker, quieter, as I ventured deeper into the woods. After a few minutes, I realized I'd lost sight of the light. It had vanished, leaving me alone in the darkness, the silence pressing down on me, thick and suffocating. My heart pounded as I looked around, trying to find my way back, but everything looked the same. Dark trees, twisted branches, shadows stretching long in the dim light. Then, just as I was beginning to panic, I saw it again. A faint glow just ahead, hovering between the trees. I felt a wave of relief, thinking it would lead me out, and I followed, my footsteps echoing in the stillness. But each time I got close, the light drifted further, leading me deeper into the forest, winding through narrow trails and dense thickets. Finally, the light stopped, hovering just above the ground, illuminating a small, open clearing surrounded by tall, twisted trees. I stepped into the clearing, feeling a chill crawl down my spine, and that's when I noticed them. Other lights, dozens of them, floating around the edges of the clearing, their glow casting strange shadows over the ground. I stood there, frozen, as the lights circled around me, their glow growing brighter, filling the air with an eerie, unearthly glow. They moved closer, closing in, and I felt a cold, hollow dread seep into my bones. I backed away, heart pounding, but the lights surrounded me, their glow flickering, their movement rhythmic, like a silent dance. Then I heard it, a soft, faint whisper drifting through the air, barely audible, but unmistakable. Stay. The word echoed in the silence, filling the clearing with a sorrowful, haunting tone. I felt a strange urge to stay, to let the lights surround me, but fear overpowered it, and I turned, running back through the trees, the lights trailing behind me, their glow flickering like ghostly lanterns. I didn't stop running until I reached the road, my breath coming in gasps, my heart racing. When I looked back, the lights were gone, leaving only darkness, silence, and the faint echo of that haunting whisper. Since that night, I've avoided the forest, too afraid of what lies within. But sometimes, on quiet evenings, I see them, faint glows, hovering at the edge of the trees, waiting, watching. Their soft light a reminder of the spirits that haunt the shadows of the woods, the stranger at the end of the hall. When I moved into my apartment, I was thrilled to have a place of my own. It was a quiet building, old but well kept, with creaky floors and tall ceilings. I quickly settled into a routine, enjoying the peace and solitude. But one night, as I was getting ready for bed, I noticed something strange. I was brushing my teeth, my gaze drifting toward the hallway that stretched from the bathroom to my bedroom. Out of the corner of my eye, I saw a figure, a dark shape, standing at the end of the hall, its form barely visible in the dim light. I turned, heart pounding, but the hall was empty, silent, stretching into shadow. I laughed it off, convincing myself it was nothing, just my mind playing tricks in the dark. But as the days passed, I saw it again and again, always at the end of the hall, watching, waiting. It was just a faint shape, barely visible, like a shadow that didn't belong. One night, unable to ignore it any longer, I decided to confront whatever was haunting me. I stood at the end of the hall, staring into the darkness, my heart racing, my mind filled with a strange, gnawing fear. For a moment, there was nothing, just silence, thick and heavy. But then I saw it, the figure, slowly taking shape, its outline becoming clearer, more defined. It was tall, its face hidden in shadow, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I felt a surge of fear, but I forced myself to stand my ground, refusing to let it scare me. "Who are you?" I whispered, my voice barely more than a breath. The figure didn't move, didn't respond, just stood there, silent and still, its gaze piercing, unblinking. I felt its presence, a cold, heavy weight that pressed down on me, filling the air with a sense of dread that seeped into my bones. Finally, the figure raised a hand, pointing down the hall, its movements slow, deliberate. I turned, following its gesture, and saw nothing, just the empty hallway, stretching into shadow. But when I looked back, the figure was gone, vanished into the darkness, leaving only silence, thick and oppressive. The next night it returned, standing at the end of the hall, its gaze fixed on me, its presence heavy, unyielding. This time I felt a strange urge to approach it, to understand, to listen. I took a step forward, then another, my heart pounding, my mind racing with questions. But just as I reached the end of the hall, the figure moved, retreating into the shadows, its gaze lingering on me, filled with a sorrow so deep it made my chest ache. I called out, my voice trembling, but there was no response, only silence, thick and unrelenting. Since then, I've seen it almost every night, always at the end of the hall, always watching, waiting. I don't know what it wants or why it haunts me, but I can feel its presence, a weight that fills the air. A silent reminder of the spirit that lingers, waiting, watching, a shadow that will never leave. The phantom bell. There's an old, abandoned schoolhouse just outside my town. It's been closed for years, its windows boarded up, its walls cracked and crumbling. Local legends say that it's haunted, that the spirits of students who never left still roam the halls. People say that on quiet nights, you can hear the school bell ringing, echoing through the empty rooms, calling for students who never left. One autumn evening, on a dare from some friends, I decided to visit. We climbed over the rusted fence, making our way through the overgrown yard, our flashlights casting eerie shadows over the walls. The school loomed before us, silent and still, its windows dark and empty, like hollow eyes watching our every move. We reached the front door, and as we stepped inside, a chill washed over me, the air thick with the scent of dust and decay. The silence was absolute, oppressive, pressing down on us as we made our way through the narrow hallways. Each step echoed in the stillness, filling the air with a hollow sound that seemed to linger, as though the building itself were listening. We wandered through empty classrooms, our footsteps stirring up clouds of dust, our flashlights illuminating old desks and faded chalkboards covered in ghostly scribbles. The walls were lined with lockers, their doors hanging open, their insides dark and empty, filled with an eerie quiet that made my skin crawl. Just as we were about to leave, I heard it, a faint, distant ringing, drifting through the silence. It was soft at first, barely audible, but it grew louder, filling the air with a haunting, echoing sound. My friends stopped, their faces pale, their eyes wide with fear as we listened to the bell, its tone mournful, sorrowful, as though it were calling to us from somewhere deep within the school. We followed the sound, our footsteps echoing through the empty halls, our hearts pounding as the ringing grew louder, filling the air with a strange, unearthly energy. It led us to the old gymnasium, a large, cavernous space filled with shadows and silence. The bell rang again, louder this time, reverberating through the room, its tone filled with an urgency that made my chest ache. And then I saw them. Shadows, barely visible, flickering at the edges of my vision, moving through the gymnasium like memories brought to life. They were students, their forms faint and blurred, their faces filled with sadness, with a longing that seemed endless. One of them looked at me, her gaze unblinking, her eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it made my heart pound. She raised a hand, reaching out, her movements slow, deliberate, as though she were trapped, bound to the bell's haunting call. "Come with us," she whispered, her voice soft, barely more than a breath. A chill washed over me, and I backed away, heart racing, my mind reeling with fear. The bell rang again, louder, its tone filled with an urgency that seemed to press down on me, calling, pleading. I turned, running through the hallways, the sound of the bell following me, echoing through the empty rooms, filling the air with a sorrowful, haunting tone. When I reached the door, I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of the shadows standing in the hallway, their gazes fixed on me, their expressions filled with a sadness that seemed endless, timeless. We left the schoolhouse that night, the bell's mournful toll echoing in our minds, filling us with a dread that lingered long after we were gone. And even now, when I pass by that old, abandoned building, I hear it. The faint, distant ringing of the school bell, calling to those who will never leave. A reminder of the spirits that haunt its hollow halls. The face in the darkened window. There's an old mansion in my neighborhood, a towering Gothic structure with tall windows and iron gates. It's been empty for as long as I can remember. Its walls covered in ivy, its windows dark and empty. People say it's haunted, that strange things happen inside, but no one ever goes near it. One winter evening, as I was walking home, I felt a strange urge to stop and look at the mansion. The air was cold, and a thick fog had settled over the street, casting eerie shadows over the houses. The mansion loomed ahead, silent and still, its dark windows watching like hollow eyes. Just as I was about to look away, I saw it, a face staring at me from one of the upstairs windows. It was barely visible in the dim light, but it was there, pale and unblinking, its gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. I stumbled back, heart pounding, but I couldn't tear my eyes away. The face remained, its expression solemn, its eyes filled with a sorrow so deep it seemed to press down on me, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive dread. I tried to convince myself it was nothing, just my imagination, a trick of the light. But the face was unmistakably real, watching, waiting. I felt an overwhelming urge to go inside, to see for myself, to understand who or what was watching me from the shadows. But fear held me in place, and I turned, hurrying home, the memory of that face lingering in my mind, filling me with a dread that clung to me like a shadow. The next night, unable to resist, I walked by the mansion again. The fog was thicker this time, casting a ghostly glow over the street, and as I looked up, I saw the face again, watching from the same window, its gaze fixed on me. Its expression filled with a sorrow that seemed endless, timeless. I felt a strange pull, a compulsion to approach, and before I knew it, I was standing at the gate, my hands gripping the iron bars, my gaze locked onto the figure in the window. The face tilted slightly, as though acknowledging me, and I heard it, a faint, hollow whisper drifting through the silence, barely audible. "Come closer." The words sent a chill down my spine, and I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with fear. But the whisper grew louder, filling the air with a haunting, sorrowful tone, as though the figure were calling to me, pleading, begging me to listen. I turned, running down the street, the memory of the face haunting me, filling my mind with questions, with a dread I couldn't shake. I tried to avoid the mansion after that, to forget the face, but the memory lingered, a constant reminder of the figure watching from the shadows. Now, whenever I pass by that old mansion, I see it, the pale face in the upstairs window, watching, waiting, its gaze filled with a sadness so deep it seems to reach into my soul. And sometimes, on quiet nights, I hear the whisper, faint but constant, calling me back, a reminder of the spirit that haunts the shadows of the darkened mansion. The man in the cemetery. There's a cemetery on the edge of my town, an old, overgrown place that most people avoid. It's filled with towering gravestones, crooked and weathered by time, their inscriptions barely visible. The cemetery has an eerie reputation. Locals say it's haunted, that strange things happen there after dark. People claim to have seen shadows moving among the graves, heard faint whispers drifting through the air. I'd always been skeptical, dismissing the stories as nothing more than local lore. But one autumn evening, I decided to go. It was just before dusk, and a thick fog hung low over the ground, casting a ghostly glow over the cemetery. I wandered through the rows of headstones, the air cold and still, my footsteps muffled by the soft, damp earth. The silence was heavy, pressing down on me, filling the air with a quiet that seemed unnatural. As I reached the far corner of the cemetery, I saw him, a man standing by an old, crumbling gravestone. He was tall and thin, dressed in dark clothes, his figure barely visible in the fading light. His back was to me, and he seemed lost in thought, his gaze fixed on something I couldn't see. I hesitated, watching him from a distance, feeling a strange sense of unease. I didn't want to disturb him, but something about him felt wrong, out of place, as though he didn't quite belong. I took a step closer, and the sound of my footstep echoed through the silence. The man turned slowly, his face hidden in shadow, his gaze fixed on me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. His eyes were dark, hollow, filled with a sadness so deep it seemed to reach into my soul. He didn't move, didn't speak, just stared at me, his presence filling the air with a heavy, oppressive dread. I tried to speak, to break the silence, but the words caught in my throat. The man took a step forward, his movement slow, deliberate, as though each step required an enormous effort. He raised a hand, pointing to the ground beside him, his gaze never leaving mine. "Help me," he whispered, his voice barely more than a breath, filled with a sorrow that made my chest ache. A chill ran down my spine, and I backed away, my heart pounding, my mind reeling with fear. But the man continued to approach, his eyes fixed on mine, his hand outstretched, as though he were reaching for something only I could give. "Please, don't leave." The words echoed in the silence, each one laced with a desperation that seemed endless, timeless. I felt a strange urge to stay, to listen, but fear overpowered it, and I turned, running through the cemetery, my footsteps echoing in the stillness, his voice following me, growing fainter with each step. When I reached the gate, I glanced back, half expecting to see him standing there, watching me leave. But the cemetery was empty, silent, as though nothing had happened, as though he had never been there at all. I haven't returned to the cemetery since, but his voice haunts me, filling my mind with a sorrow that lingers, a reminder of the man I left behind in the shadows. And sometimes, when I pass by, I feel his gaze, heavy and unblinking, watching from the dark, waiting for someone to hear his plea. The unmarked road. There's an old, narrow road just outside my town that winds through the forest, a forgotten path that few people travel. It's hidden from the main road, almost overgrown with weeds and wildflowers, and most locals avoid it, saying it leads nowhere. People call it the unmarked road, and there are stories, strange, unsettling tales of people who took that road and never came back. One evening, out of curiosity, I decided to explore it. The sky was overcast, the air heavy with the scent of rain, and as I drove down the narrow path, the trees closed in around me, their branches casting long, twisted shadows over the road. The silence was thick, broken only by the crunch of gravel under my tires, and a strange, gnawing unease settled over me. The road seemed to go on forever, winding deeper into the woods, the trees growing denser, their shadows darker. I thought about turning back, but a strange pull kept me moving forward, a compulsion to see where the road would lead. Finally, after what felt like hours, I reached a clearing. The road ended abruptly, and there, in the center of the clearing, was an old, abandoned house. It was dark and crumbling, its windows shattered, its roof sagging, and the air around it was thick with an oppressive, heavy silence. I stepped out of the car, feeling a chill crawl down my spine, and approached the house, drawn by a strange, inexplicable pull. The door creaked open as I pushed it, revealing a dark, empty room filled with shadows. The air inside was stale, thick with dust, and the faint scent of something rotten. As I stepped inside, the floorboards groaned under my weight, and a faint whisper drifted through the silence, barely audible, like a voice speaking from just beyond the walls. I froze, heart pounding, straining to listen, and the whisper grew louder, filling the room with a haunting, sorrowful tone. "Come closer." The words echoed in my mind, each one filled with a sorrow that seeped into my bones, filling me with a strange, gnawing dread. I took a step back, my hand gripping the door frame, but the whisper continued, growing louder, more insistent, as though something or someone were calling to me from the darkness. I turned to leave, but the door slammed shut, the sound echoing through the empty house, filling the air with a heavy, oppressive weight. The whisper grew louder, filling my mind, and I felt a strange pull, an urge to stay, to listen, to understand. Then, just as suddenly as it had begun, the whisper stopped, replaced by a deep, hollow silence. I felt a presence behind me, a weight pressing down on me, and I turned slowly, my breath catching as I saw it, a figure, barely visible in the shadows, watching me with an intensity that made my skin crawl. The figure took a step closer, its movements slow, deliberate, its gaze fixed on me with an unblinking stare. I stumbled back, heart racing, and the whisper returned, soft and faint, filling the air with a sorrowful, haunting tone. "Don't leave." The words echoed in the silence, each one filled with a desperation that made my chest ache, but fear overpowered it, and I bolted, running through the house, my footsteps echoing in the empty rooms, the whisper following me, growing fainter with each step. When I reached the car, I glanced back, catching a final glimpse of the figure standing in the doorway, watching me leave, its gaze filled with a sorrow that seemed endless, timeless. I left the unmarked road that night, my mind filled with questions, with a fear I couldn't shake. And now, every time I pass by the narrow path, I feel its pull, a silent reminder of the spirit I left behind in the shadows, waiting, watching, hoping for someone to hear its plea.